The Progressive Movement. In this video, we will explore the progressive movement and its attempts to reform the government to remedy the injustices and problems left by rapid industrialization. The Progressive Era. The Progressive Era goes from 1890 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. During this time, progressivism, a new social philosophy, flourished. Progressives believed that advances in science, economic development, and social organization were vital to the progress of humanity. The rapid industrial growth, however, had not resulted in progress for every American, but rather caused numerous social problems. Progressivism did not oppose industrialization per se, but believed that the government had to correct the abuses and problems generated so that Americans could enjoy better lives. Progressives challenged the ideas of social Darwinism and advocated reforms to move the government from a laissez-faire to a regulation approach to prevent or correct the worst abuses of economic power. The Social Gospel Movement. Progressives often acted out of a sense of moral responsibility derived from religion. At the end of the 19th century, many Protestant pastors openly advocated for social reform, including better working conditions, better social services, and the abolition of child labor. Many groups were formed to carry out their Christian duties to help the less fortunate. The social gospel movement sought to coordinate the efforts of churches and private charities with those of the government to help people in need. Among these efforts, we have the Salvation Army and the Colorado Methodists, who established a free hospital, a night school for adults, and a summer camp for children. Another important effort within this movement was the establishment of settlement houses. Jane Addams ran a settlement house in Chicago known as Hull House. Settlement houses were typically located in the slums and immigrant ghettos and provided services to immigrants and poor people. Their basic services included childcare, nursing of the sick, English lessons, and help in obtaining U.S. citizenship through naturalization. Middle-class women were often active in campaigning for better trash collection, sewers, hospitals, and other public services. At one time, there were as many as 400 settlement houses operating in the United States. Members of the social gospel movement also promoted temperance, calling for a ban on alcoholic drinks, which they saw as one of the chief causes of many social problems. The Muckrakers. One of the most influential progressives were muckrakers, journalists, writers, and social scientists that exposed the abuse and corruption of industrial society. They were called muckrakers because they raked through the muck of American life, exposing some of the most horrible problems and evils in industrial society. Their writing style appealed to the public and quickly gained readership across the nation, stimulating the public in favor of the need for reform. Some of the most famous muckrakers of the time include Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, a novel about the lives of immigrants working in Chicago's meatpacking industry. Sinclair exposed the horrible working conditions at the plants, as well as harmful practices such as putting dead rats and rat poison in sausage meat. Even though his purpose was to denounce the terrible working conditions and abuse at these plants, the public was more concerned about the quality of the products they consumed. Ida Tarbell, who wrote A History of the Standard Oil Company, revealed how Rockefeller's celebrated success was largely based on ruthless and unethical business practices. Jacob Riis was a photojournalist and writer who published How the Other Half Lives. His pictures documented child labor and extreme poverty conditions in American cities. Other muckrakers included Lincoln Steffens, who examined corruption in city governments, Ray Stannard Baker, who reported on the conditions of African Americans in both the North and the South, and Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus, a novel describing the abuses of railroad companies over California farmers. Progressive organizations. Other progressives formed associations to promote social change and professional responsibility. Some of the organizations founded during this period include the American Bar Association, which set up standards and ethic codes for the law profession, the National Women's Suffrage Association, the NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the Anti-Defamatory League, which opposed religious prejudice and anti-Semitism. Women reformers. Women faced many obstacles, from not being able to vote to the lack of education and career opportunities. Still, some women worked persistently as reformers. We will examine 4 of them. Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony grew up in a Quaker family in Massachusetts. She supported abolition and the temperance movement. She is well known as a fighter for women's rights, especially women's suffrage. Her efforts included co-founding the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA, and publishing a weekly journal on women's rights. Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley lived in Hull Settlement House in Chicago. Kelley was an active fighter for labor rights, including the minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and the abolishment of child labor and sweatshop conditions. Kelley became Illinois' chief factory inspector and had an important role in persuading the Supreme Court to limit women's hours in Muller v. Oregon. Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Chapman Catt was active in Iowa's suffrage movement. She closely worked with Susan B. Anthony and succeeded her as president of the American National Women's Suffrage Association. Later, she also founded the League of Women's Voters. Alice Paul. Alice Paul was a well-educated woman with both a PhD and a law degree. She traveled to England to join the suffrage movement there. Alice Paul organized many protests, including a march in Washington, D.C. before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and picketed in front of the White House, where she was arrested in 1917. In prison, Alice went on a hunger strike and had to be force-fed. Her tactics persuaded President Woodrow Wilson that an amendment to grant suffrage rights to women was necessary. Political reforms. At the municipal level, political machines were exposed and soon lost their political grip over big cities. Progressive mayors were elected, and public services were expanded, especially sanitation, garbage collection, and public utilities. Progressives discouraged corruption in cities by using city commissions, which included experts on urban planning and services, as well as using city managers, which operated the city more efficiently. At the state level, progressives from both parties were elected as governors and introduced many reforms. The leading progressive governor of the time was Robert La Follette from Wisconsin, but soon other states would also elect progressive governors and legislatures. Some reforms that were introduced to free state governments from corruption include the secret ballot, which allowed voters to mark their ballots in private, making them less subject to pressure or intimidation. Initiative, which allowed citizens to introduce bills into the state legislature. Referendum, which allowed voters to repeal a law already passed through a special referendum election. Recall elections, which allowed voters to recall or dismiss elected officials. Direct primaries, which allowed voters to pick their party's nominees in a special election. Direct election of senators allowed voters the power to elect their senators. Since the Constitution had given state legislatures the power to appoint senators, the 17th Amendment was introduced and ratified, changing the Constitution so that the voters could elect their senators directly. Social and economic reforms. Reforms were passed to deal with the worst social and economic effects of industrialization. Laws started regulating urban housing conditions, safety and health conditions in factories, the number of hours women could work, giving compensation to injured workers, and abolishing work for young children. In 1911, there was a fire at the Triangle Shirt Waist Factory in New York City, which led to the death of 146 female workers just because doors were bolted and there were no adequate fire escapes. This event led to the passage of state laws providing for fire safety codes for factories. The temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement would continue their efforts, and eventually, in 1919, the sale of alcohol drinks was banned by the 18th Amendment. The next year, women would get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment.